Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here. So many of you should be acknowledged, but I will acknowledge, of course, Gareth Evans, who brilliantly employed me. He has several other achievements to his claim too. It's great to see Andre Hermeyer here, who is an outstanding minister in successive Labor governments. Of course, we have Jacinta Collins. Well, she'll always be Senator Collins to me. And it's great to see Rob Lady here too, who's also served in the State Parliament. And I'd also like to acknowledge Mary, and I had a separate sort of component, but of course she has served in Parliament, and of course is Michael's remarkable partner. I first remember meeting, Dr. Daniel Molino's here as well, the hope of the side, and I'm very pleased that Daniel serves in the Parliament. And I don't know if he's here, but if Bill Kelty's here, just great Australian. Any good idea I've ever had's his, any failure to implement's mine. So it is lovely to be amongst friends, but when Michael mentioned this opportunity to catch up, I thought, well, fantastic. And I should just talk a little bit about Michael and Mary specifically. I understand Mary, of course, came out of Victorian Young Labor. They had a very successful generation, which included Garth and included Andre. But I first met Mary and Michael when Michael was at the New South Wales Labor Council, and dare I say it, the glory years of the New South Wales Labor Council. I mean, they've been successful since, but I think that was an era where Michael's intellect as a thinker, as a moderate Labor union leader, I think was very influential on a lot of us coming through the Labor movement, starting off. And Michael continues to contribute now along with Mary. Now, I've looked at the three books that we're launching today, and of course I would have launched Mary's book on superannuation, but you didn't ask me to. I did, I know. And when Mary, at least when you launch one of Mary's books, she gives you a fabulous tie, Michael. But tonight is Michael's night and his books. And now when looking through the book about John Christian Watson, I understand that the idea for this came not dissimilar. I mean, John Christian Watson came from Valparaiso to Australia, but I think Michael was on a voyage from Barcelona to Western Australia, and he didn't have much else to do, so he decided to write the book on Watson. Those bracing sea airs. But I also understand both the story of Watson and the story, his book, of course, on Whitlam, Prime Minister Whitlam, have been launched a number of times before. I think Prime Minister Albanese has launched both books. I think Deputy Prime Minister Miles has launched one of the books. So it's good that you've asked me to launch them again, Michael. No, lose one election, lose two, whatever. Anyway, no, enough self-sledging. I'll leave that to News Limited and friends in the party. But in particular, I'd like to talk tonight about the book on Scullin, if that's all right, Michael. I think James Scullin deserves more than being the trivia question about name the one-term government in Australia. I think James Scullin looms large in the Labor subconscious as well as the conscious, and I think this is the first monograph or book written about James Scullin since 1974, so long overdue for a revisit. And I think the monograph does achieve that, and I would encourage you to do it. There's many gems in it, and there's insights as well. There's gems of facts, but there's insights as well. And I just wanted to extrapolate some of the insights that I took from Michael's research and writing. I mean, he deserves to be remembered for more than being a one-term government. And I think Michael addresses that fundamental unfairness about the coverage of Scullin. In particular, Scullin was the first Irish Catholic to become a Prime Minister of Australia, and he came through at a time where James Scullin, and I'm not quite sure the conclusion that Michael drew in the book about him, but was able to reconcile his secular view. Scullin, interestingly, was involved with a committee, because of course in the Labor Party we need a committee to set up the socialist objective. And then he was involved in subsequent conferences where the socialist objectives seemed to move a bit away from the 1921 aspirations. But he was a leader who reconciled his religious values, which ran very deeply. And I love the idea that he could see, I don't know if it was Michael or James Scullin who coined this or someone else, but it's in the book, that Pope Leo XIII was the working class pope, or the working man's pope, with Reverum Novarum in 1891. But Scullin was a leader who tried to reconcile his view of the secular with his religious views. Whether or not that was a tension or was an easier journey, I'll leave it for Michael to discuss when he talks about Scullin. But it does remind, I think, the family of Labor that people can hold views of faith and be consistent with the proposition of social justice. So that was one proposition I took early out of reading the monograph, but it goes further than that. Of course, it was very interesting to know that Scullin was a very active Australian Workers' Union official. But when you read about Scullin's early organising, he was first elected to Corangamite in 1913. I think Stuart MacArthur ran against him then. No, I just made that up. Stuart MacArthur, the Liberal, was famously the only MP in the caucus older than John Winston Howard, so that gave him longevity. He then lost again in 1914. But there's a proposition about, Michael's writing about Scullin, I think, reminds us of an Australia which Labor has, perhaps in its modernity, forgotten. That is that we were a party which succeeded electorally well in non-metropolitan Australia. And reading about the organising efforts of James Scullin and small towns in the Otways and around the district, around Ballarat, it gives us a glimpse of what was. Now, the universe doesn't take us back into time, and of course, then a lot more Australians lived outside of our big cities. But it's clear that at certain points, sliding door moments in Labor's history since the time of Scullin, perhaps accelerated by the split in 1955, but at other times since, that Labor invested in the regions of Australia. And that is, again, I think, an insight which is still pretty contemporaneous for now. To be a party of people who have faith, to be a party which understands the value of the regions as well as the cities. But then we get on to the, I think, beyond the trivia question of what was the only one-term government in Australia, I think James Scullin has unfortunately been attributed with the building up of this consciousness in Labor that we get elected when times are tough, and that seems to be our fate, one of timing. And was he unlucky to be elected in that week in October when Wall Street collapsed? And I think the Labor Party has imbibed by osmosis some of that view. Sometimes we think that our timing is unlucky. Of course, James Scullin got the seat of Yarra when his Labor predecessor, died, so good for Mr. Scullin, not so good for Frank Tudor. And then again, he got the leadership, or the deputy leadership of the party, following the passing of another Labor figure. So Scullin's timing wasn't always bad. But then we get to 1929. And I think this is one of our challenges for Labor. We must never have a chip on our shoulder. We must never look at our history as being just a series of accidents of history. Scullin, whilst he lost by the largest margin ever in Australian electoral history in 1931, he won by the largest electoral margin in Australian electoral history in 1929. And I think the version of history which says that he got elected, then a series of economic catastrophes really rendered Labor out of office very quickly, I think fails to look at the underlying events and Scullin's accomplishments. I mean, when you think about it, Scullin had to deal with Lang and the breakaway New South Wales movement. I mean, He had to deal with premiers who fitted him up with the Niemeyer plan. He had to deal with a very active communist insurgency in the trade unions of Comintern. He had to deal with the fact that he went to the Imperial Conference in 1930 in the second half to negotiate a pretty favourable deal for Australia in terms of debt and our payments. And he had to do so with a treasurer with a cloud on his head from a failed mining venture from the 1920s. I'm talking about, of course, Ted Theodore and the Mungana controversy. So this was a bloke who really had a lot on his plate. But at the same time, he forged ahead with a view of workplace relations or industrial relations and the powers there. And he was and Michael will have a more granular and a better qualitative understanding, but he was a proto-Keynesian in terms of how to tackle economic demand at a time when we were experiencing massive unemployment. So I think Scullin is an underrated figure in our national story. He reflects the colonial aspiration of working class people at the end of the 19th century. He was an autodidact. When he suffered, I mean, Michael does ambitiously say he suffered a football injury at 10. I should have used that excuse too. But in all seriousness, he did read all of Dickens's books in his convalescence at the age of 10. But of course, there wasn't social media to keep him busy. But then you look at the times that he was there. He was part of the building of the Labor Party, and he went through the conscription split. I mean, a lot of erstwhile Labor leaders up till that point left. As he says in his Watson book, John Christian Watson didn't have a map of what the Labor Party should look like. Although you could argue some current structural governors don't care about the map of what we look like. The proposition that Watson had to be a pathfinder, well, Scullin was there for all of those debates. And he was there at a time when he could bring people together. And it was a very dynamic time for the Labor Party. I mean, it's very interesting that in 1906, when Scullin first ran, he ran against Alfred Deakin, affable Alfred Deakin in 1906. Watson didn't turn up to campaign for him. But interestingly, Ramsay MacDonald, who was the British Labor leader, did turn up in Ballarat and campaign for Scullin. Scullin was there. So I think he's a considerable figure. So considerable figure in that he represents, I think, a strand of Australian Labor activity which we would be well reminded to try and engage with, be it faith, be it the bush, but also in his period in office, extraordinarily big challenges. And so I don't think it's fair to just say that he's a one-term government. I think you've got to look at the scale. He may have experienced failure, but he himself was not a failure. And then from 1931, perhaps the second of the final insights which I wanted to share with you from what I read from Michael's work, is he then served in the Parliament and continued to serve. Interesting point. But he was of great use to Curtin, and indeed his office was between Curtin's and Chifley's. And so he was a person who understood that you didn't have to be the leader to be a leader. And I think that's very significant. And rancour is easy, and as we know, in politics, very few people walk out. They generally are carried out, generally by other people. But it would be clear from your reading of Scullin that he was a contributor. And he supported the future administrations of Labor. So I think that's a very powerful insight, and it's a good lesson for people in the modern movement that you can contribute, and that it's up to the person themselves to be whether or not they are consumed by a sense of what they haven't got the chance to do or what they can contribute, and the absolute privilege to serve. But the very final thing, and I went to the Melbourne General Cemetery just to have a look at what's written on the cross. I mean, I believed it when it was written in Michael's book, but I thought it was sufficiently interesting. That great tradition of the Melbourne General Cemetery where they have political figures. On his Celtic cross, it is written, and I think this really sums it up, and it was a philosophy which he had at the end of the 19th century, carried through the first half of the 20th century, but I'd put to you, these words ring true now. Justice and humanity demand interference whenever the weak are being crushed by the strong. Great thoughts by a great politician.
Thank you.